All right, well, we still have people funneling in, but let's go ahead and get started since we only have an hour together today.
Sure.
My name is Carol Glasser, and I'm currently chairing the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association. And we are co-hosting a new colloquium series. This is our inaugural colloquium, so I'm really excited for this one. We're co-hosting it with Animals and Society Institute. And Ivy Collier is going to go ahead and put a link in the chat where you can, if you're interested in knowing more about them, you can see their website. But Ivy, if you want to say a couple words, that would be wonderful.
Hi. Okay. Well, I can't hear myself, so I hope that everyone can hear me. I'm just delighted to be here and to be a co-sponsor today. And so yes, I will go ahead and put that link down in the chat box, and do visit the ASI website and also our social media too. So thank you so much, and I'm delighted to be a part of our session today. I am going to keep my video off because I'm flashing, and I hope that you guys can't see that, but I am still here. So thank you.
Thank you. And so if you are a sociologist and you're not currently in the Animals and Society section of the ASA, I encourage you to learn more about it. I'm just going to put my email right there, and I would love to talk to you one-on-one about it. And probably everyone here would enjoy being a member of ASI. So I encourage you to learn more about that organization, get on their email list, and find out more if you don't currently know about them or work with ASI. So now I want to turn it to the reason why we're all actually here today. And that is for our inaugural colloquium, Revolutionizing Animal Shelters, Emerging Models of Community, Compassion, and Care. So I would like to introduce our two speakers and then hand it over to them. First, we have Kristen Hassen. She's Maddie's director of American Pets Alive. She has a lot of experience working in various shelters and shelter settings. And I will let each of the speakers tell you a little bit more about their background as to what they think is relevant, because both of them are very accomplished and have been doing work in their various areas for many years. And I don't want to take the next 15 minutes just on introductions. And then I would like to introduce Katja Guenther, who is a professor of gender and sexuality studies at the University of California at Riverside. And she was recently she recently authored a book, The Lives and Deaths of Shelter Animals, which brought her into the work that they're going to be talking about specifically today. So with that, I'm going to turn off my camera, and I'm going to hand everything over to Kristen and Katja.
Thank you so much. We're both so happy to be here. So I think we'll start by telling you just a little bit more about our backgrounds and why we're here to speak with you about this today. I'll go first. I'm Kristen, and I led open admission government animal shelters in large cities for about a decade. Today, I have taken that experience and help other shelters around the country and around the world try to change the way that they're operating. I am an adjunct instructor in the Department of One Health at the University of Arizona, and I am on the board of the National Animal Control Association and lead something called the Human Animal Support Services Project, which is a collaborative movement of about 5,000 individuals and now 1,500 animal welfare organizations, all aiming to fundamentally transform the work of animal welfare in the United States and beyond.
Hey, Katja, do you want to introduce yourself?
I do. I'm having trouble unmuting.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Sorry, I'm having trouble unmuting. I might just stay unmuted, Kristen, just so you know, because this seems to be a little bit of a glitch on my end today. So yes, Carol said, my name is Katja Guenther. I'm a professor in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies at UC Riverside. my academic or intellectual background and training comes through sociology, but I have longstanding interest specifically in feminist politics and in women's activism and all the diversity of its forms. And I spent about 7 years volunteering and conducting ethnography inside of a high-take, high-kill animal shelter in the Los Angeles area where I live, and used that analysis as the basis for my book, The Lives and Deaths of Shelter Animals, which wonderfully also brought me into conversation with a lot of different actors inside of the animal sheltering movement, and has created a lot of great opportunities for me as I keep working in this in the area of feminist and critical animal studies, to interact with and learn from and share ideas with people working in sheltering directly, and also many folks academically across disciplines who are engaged with companion animal rights and welfare issues as well. So I'm excited to be here. I think I speak for Kristen as well with that.
Well, I'm going to kick it off today, and we just want to say, for those of you who are here, this is really meant to be an interactive talk. And so we're going to make some brief introductory comments just so we set the kind of scope about what we're talking about today, because this is an enormous topic. And then we really want to hear from you, but comments, questions, etc. And you can do that by entering into the Q&A or entering into the chat, and we'll be monitoring both of those and as we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got here today. Maybe you're a person who works in animal welfare volunteers, or maybe you have almost no experience working or even going into an animal shelter, but animal shelters and animal services, which is the whole thing, everything from the shelter to the animal control function, they are just like almost all other US institutions, both in the time in history in which they were formed, and how they developed over many decades and centuries. And so they're not unlike hospitals, prisons, schools, and that they have a long, robust history in the United States, and a contested history too, I'll mention. So the modern animal shelter really came to be in the early to mid 19th century. And really, we saw the birth of government animal services versus the old system, which was a bounty system where people would be independently contracted to go round up and kill or to shoot animals. So we see, as urbanization in the US increases, government takes over animal control. And this started as large campaigns to round up massive numbers of animals. In the 1850s and 1860s in New York, in just a week, more than 1,000 dogs would be rounded up and then drowned in the Hudson River, if they were not immediately reclaimed by their owners. But really, the whole point was to take animals out of communities and initially to kill them. And so during this time, even then, there was resistance to the system, which seemed really awful and inhumane. And we see the birth of early SPCAs and humane societies who do come in to rescue only a few of those lucky animals. So not all animals are saved, maybe 1 to 3 to 5% of the animals are saved. And typically the more desirable pets, the purebred looking animals, not unlike some things that happen today. So this whole system, it's punitive. It is built off of a policing model. Animal control comes directly out of a policing model. And it's also built, and this is probably my key point today, the whole thing hinges on separating companion animals. Dogs and cats come in a little bit later, along with a lot of other animals, separating them permanently and completely from the people and communities that they're connected to, so that once an animal is removed, it is eradicated or put into a new community with a new owner and new family. And then a few of those animals end up going back home. So this system accompanied criminalization of free roaming dogs, which was not a thing before the 1850s. A lot of people, and many of you maybe remember, you had free roaming animals running around when you were young. A lot of us do. So the intensification of the criminalization of free roaming animals has been rather recent in many places, but it all started in the mid-19th century, and this accompanied licensing laws, leash laws, muzzling laws, and impoundment fees. So there were always two components, a punishment for the owner or caregiver and a fee or a fine. And those fees and fines in the early days were often much more than the average person could pay. And that was actually intentionally to discourage poor people from reclaiming their animals. And that is openly talked about in literature and newspapers of that time. Finally, there has always been a public safety mandate. And so the underlying assumption of the entire system, still the system we have today, is that public safety, that the well-being and safety of our communities is dependent on removing companion animals from those communities, so that unconfined animals pose an immediate threat to human well-being through disease, through biting. Of course, in the mid-1800s, we're looking at rabies, which people really didn't understand, and importantly, a danger to traffic, which at the time was a lot of horses, but a danger to transportation. And so animal control and sheltering developed around this time and have changed very little when it comes to the structure they operate on, even though shelters are much different today. So today, we all know animal shelters are different places. We see all kinds of pictures of cuddly animals in cute cages getting homes. And there have been important interventions into the system. Spay-neuter came in the 1970s, which really decreased pet overpopulation and the number of animals killed in shelters. People started to be allowed to go inside animal shelters, which was not common. Shelters were typically closed places where people couldn't go in. And we also saw the no-kill movement come in and assert that it was immoral and inhumane for animals to come into shelters and just be killed without a chance to get out, and asserted that every animal should have a chance at a live outcome. However, shelters are still operating on the foundation of separation, a punitive model, and a public safety mandate. So these three things are really still guiding the work of animal shelters. And all of the great stuff we've gotten to do, and I'm a person who's run animal shelters over 10 years and has gotten to do a lot of that stuff, it's all built on that broken foundation. And that is why we find this to be such a conundrum and a hard problem to solve. And we still know 1.5 million animals approximately are still killed in shelters in the US every year. So in most places, wherever you go in a modern animal shelter, a person who is struggling with their pet has two options. So a person that can't pay their medical bill, their veterinary bill, can't find housing, they have two options. One is to surrender their pet to be considered for adoption, and two is to surrender their pet for euthanasia. So these are really still the two options most people are given. What is not given as an option is support for that pet owner to keep the pet. And that isn't true everywhere, that is changing, but that has been the norm. Lost pet return rates remain very low nationally, typically below 20% of those lost pets that are coming in. The industry, we have not figured out how to get lost pets back to their owners. But when you go back to the foundation where we have a punitive structure where people face fines, potentially criminal prosecution, there is a lot of fear built into our communities over hundreds of years about what it means to come to the animal shelter to look for their pet. And most pets are entering shelters, and it has nothing to do with why they're there. Housing is a key factor in why animals end up in shelters. And if you walk through any shelter in the US right now, you will see the same pets that are there are the ones that are restricted from housing. People face financial barriers to keeping their pets. Some of the top reasons for surrender are housing, financial constraints, and too many pets. And finally, pet behavior is a key reason, but behavior is contextualized with what we know, which is that animals are often asked to live in strict confinement in small apartments. And so behavior often just means that the pet isn't fitting into that person's lifestyle. And finally, shelters are still the cause of deadly illnesses. Here in Texas, where I live, we know thousands and thousands of animals are dying from shelter-borne illnesses like parvo, distemper, and panleuk, and behavioral decline. Most animals are housed in solitary confinement, strict isolation housing away from other animals. When they're at a shelter, it is tremendously stressful, and so behavioral decline is common. So as much progress as we've made in animal sheltering, and kudos to all of you who have been doing that work, it is amazing, but we are fighting a losing battle because we are still fighting a system that is working against all of this. So my project is Human Animal Support Services, and I will, knowing what time it is, I'm going to not get too much into it, but we have thousands of folks across 50 US states and territories, now across about 25 nations, all working to say the system has to change. It is not working for animals, and it is not working for the people who love them. And we think that the entire thing needs to be totally reversed, so that instead of using separation as the starting point, we use connection as the starting point. So we keep animals and people together, and the separation happens only as a last resort. So Hassen is doing two things. We're trying to create incremental change, solving for the worst crises we're facing as an industry and preventing the deaths of animals entering shelters. But we're also building capacity to really change the whole system itself, so that we don't have to be putting these Band-Aids on a system that really isn't appropriate for the love that people have for animals. And I will say that we just had new research come out from HABRI that said 98%, that's the Human Animal Bond Research Institute, 98% of pet owners consider their pets to be family members, and family members that are as significant as their human family members. Given that knowledge, we have a responsibility to do something different. COVID taught us that we can do something different. We had the best year animal welfare has ever had during COVID. That is primarily because we didn't see as many animals entering the system. And so when we say the best year, what we mean is that more pets stayed with their families, probably because life slowed down for people because of the terrible impacts of COVID. There was this silver lining for animals. We know there are limitations to no-kill. We can keep saving the animals every single year that enter the shelters, but most of them don't need to be there. Probably about 10% of the animals that come into our shelters actually need to be in them. So a no-kill is a really important solution. And I think Dr. Guenther and I both stand on the side of no-kill. However, it is a reaction to a system that's broken, and it cannot be the only solution. And we know our system is fragile. After COVID this year, we've seen really high intakes in many shelters, especially shelters that are already in communities where intakes tend to be high. And finally, we don't know very much about why the animals are even entering our shelters. We don't understand, and there is no good data about why they're actually coming in. And so we have to learn that so that we can solve for the real problems. And lastly, the whole system is still controlled by a public safety mandate. This underlying belief in our communities that to protect the public, to keep people safe, we have to remove our animals from the public. We have to remove them from our communities. That belief has been trained into our culture for the last hundreds of years. And so undoing that is going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a collective effort to assert something different. So I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Guenther, now for maybe some more hopeful news.
Okay, wonderful. I think that Carol was able to unmute me, and my Zoom is not cooperating today. And I hit the mute. I was worried people would hear complicated sound if Kristen's voice, because I don't have earphones in today, which I normally do, but they're not in reaching range. In any case, thank you so much for that, Kristen. So what Kristen and I have really been thinking and talking about together is how we can completely reimagine the dominant model of companion animal welfare in the United States. As she's already given us a great history of, for many decades, animal sheltering has been making incremental changes And those are changes that typically emphasize improving the quality of experience of impoundment for animals in the shelter and increasing the live release rate. And those are both obviously worthy and important goals. And animal shelters in the US as a whole have made really remarkable and substantial reductions in the number of animals who are being killed in shelters, thanks both to changes that are taking place inside of shelters themselves, but also in large part because of changes that have taken place in our society more largely. But a lot of these longstanding underlying problems continue to plague shelters, as Kristen also talked about, including shelters that are ostensibly or publicly making commitments to increased live release rates. We're at a point where we no longer see how continued investment in the current system is going to allow it to move beyond its core and founding work of separating people from animals. Underneath the improvements that are made on the existing sheltering model for managing unhoused animals, the basis for operation is still this public safety model that also centers on a punitive approach towards both people and animals, and centers the work of separating people and animals and therefore disrupting human-animal relationships. Reimagining animal sheltering involves asking a lot of questions, and I think generating those questions is part of this project and moving us towards a new vision. How can communities best care for animals and for humans? Who should benefit from a new vision of animal care, and how can different groups benefit? How can we shift our relationships with and our approaches to companion animals so that they model compassion and care? In a lot of places, including the states that produce the highest proportions of shelter animals, which are Kristen and my home states, California and Texas, or she's in Texas, I'm in California, animal shelters aren't serving the populations that they claim to purport, or I should say most aren't. Right, and those populations are generally understood as impounded animals, people who've lost a companion animal, and people who are trying to adopt a companion animal. Impounded animals in many animal shelters don't have good standards of care and continue to experience shelter environments as stressful and problematic and as physically unhealthy. Further, their interest in returning to their home of origin or not is not accounted for at all in our current sheltering model. People who lose their animals still face far too many barriers to reclamation. Many adopters encounter obstacles in seeking to adopt shelter animals, whether because shelters only see adopters by appointment, require applications, implement adoption processes that last days or even weeks, or have other kinds of roadblocks in place. In some parts of the United States, unfortunately, animal shelters don't actually appear to be helping anyone, animals, guardians, or adopters. So then who are animal shelters benefiting? Animal shelters help our society maintain a sense of social order, a social order in which free-roaming dogs especially are constructed as this threat to themselves and to public safety. Free-roaming cats are often better tolerated, but there's quite a bit of local variation in that as well. And animal shelters work to provide a taxpayer-funded catch pan for the corporations, landlords, banks, real estate developers, and investors who are responsible for so much of the displacement that results in animals coming into shelters in the first place. Drawing on the work of abolitionist and disability justice scholar Liat Ben-Moshe, we can talk about and recognize how unhoused animals, like other so-called surplus populations, including unhoused people and people involved in crime, are spun into gold through what Ben-Moshe, I think, brilliantly refers to as clever capitalist alchemy. Like prisons, shelters are another way for the state to try to fix a crisis of capitalism, namely the ongoing displacement of people and companion animals, and the continued maintenance of a surplus underclass essential to depressing wages. Those of us who aren't housing insecure or are not incarcerated are disciplined into ways of living and thinking that legitimate certain forms of protection and security by extracting value from the abandonment of these entire populations, including the disabled and unemployed and poor people of color, and also unhoused animals. Animal shelters are just one site where capitalism extracts value from the displaced. Unhoused animals displaced through the routine processes of capitalism have given rise to an entire industry of shelters, humane societies, rescues, and philanthropies of all sizes. In placing blame on so-called bad shelters or so-called irresponsible owners for the, quote, problem of animal homelessness, the narratives we've built around animal sheltering in the US help hide and distort who and what the companion animal industry is really benefiting. And as part of this project of concealment and distortion, animal shelters reflect and help maintain themselves social hierarchies, including those aspects of our social order that involve human control over animals and dominant groups' control over non-dominant groups of humans, and ultimately are mitigating problems rooted in capitalist relations. If we want to benefit people who care about companion animals and also companion animals themselves, we need a different model and approach. And while such a model will continue to face limitations for sure in the context of our tremendously unequal broader society, that model can still be markedly different from what we're doing now. How we're doing things currently in companion animal welfare simply doesn't work, and we can't reform our way into something that does. In rewriting the whole story from this point forward, we especially want to imagine a radically different near present and future. We do not have to continue with this round them up and remove them approach to companion animal welfare. We can change directions entirely. We aspire to conceptualize a model of companion animal welfare in which choice, care, community, and love guide action, in which animals are not understood legally or socially as being property, and in which supporting human and animal flourishing and togetherness is a core goal. We reject carceral logics in companion animal welfare and aspire to achieve a society in which separating people from animals for whom they care and caging animals are no longer seen as reasonable things to do. The future of animal sheltering can't be just about changing animals or people, and that's really where a lot of the emphasis tends to be in some of our existing narratives. It's not about making more people so-called responsible dog or cat owners. It's not about destigmatizing a particular breed or type of animals. It's not about training dogs. It's not about creating, quote, better shelters. It's about broader changes that will benefit people and animals together. We envision the dissolution of animal shelters and the development of human-animal resource centers. Human-animal resource centers would work to help humans maintain their existing relationships with companion animals, providing services and advocacy for people struggling, for whatever reason, to maintain their relationship with a companion animal about whom they care. Human-animal support services, which Kristen already described, is engaged already in this important work, which is awesome. Human-animal resource centers would also be sites for community building, generating policy proposals, and organizing for collective action in support of their goals. They would be networked with other community resources. And importantly, human-animal resource centers would be overseen by transparent democratic bodies of governance that include representation of human and non-human animals from the community being served. Getting there, of course, is going to involve a lot of steps at different levels of social action. And in my remaining time, I'd just like to briefly outline some of those. First, we need to start from a place of commitment to keeping people and animals together. And that's a total mind shift versus what the current mode of thinking is in the animal sheltering industry. Instead of working to sever people and animals and then rehome those animals, we need this main goal to be protecting the bonds between people and animals already in their care. That shift in commitment would beget all kinds of changes, functionally eliminating barriers to shelter reclamation and developing other evidence-based programming to support keeping humans and animals together. We need any duration of stay outside of a guardian's home to be focused on getting animals back into direct human care, whether with their guardian or when necessary in a foster home. Injured, sick, orphaned pets, and animals truly unsafe for placement will need some place to go, but that place should be a place of comfort and compassion, not one of confinement, isolation, and death. Second, we need to address intersectional precarity. Intersectional precarity refers to how intersecting structures of inequality, like race, class, and gender, operate together to render some groups of people particularly vulnerable to living uncertain, unstable, and insecure economic and social lives. People and animals living in conditions of precarity typically lack security in their jobs and/or their housing, suffer from problems related to their psychological, physical, or material welfare, and also often experience state interventions, often including interactions with animal control, that are meant to police their behaviors and activities rather than to engage with them supportively. Thinking about and addressing intersectional precarity means engaging with why people become unable to care for animals and then using that knowledge to change conditions. Third, we must build solidarity between people concerned about companion animals and the humans with whom they live, and movements for economic and social justice. This includes integrating animals' concerns into efforts to support unhoused people and into broader movements for tenants' rights and against gentrification. People representing animals and companion animal guardians have to be at the table when housing policy especially is being developed. People who know about struggling with housing, policing, immigration, and other forms of displacement need to be part of decision-making within these human-animal resource centers we envision. And as part of this solidarity building, we need to recognize the interruption of human-animal bonds as another of the many forms of symbolic and physical violence people experience, especially if they're poor and/or Black, Indigenous, or people of color. The breaking of human-animal bonds is a type of trauma that, like other traumas, we need to work to eradicate. Fourth, we need to end housing restrictions against animals. Kristen already mentioned some of this data. The recent study that she was talking about found that only 8% of housing is what researchers define as fully pet inclusive. The study also estimated that at least an additional 8.2 million companion animals could find homes if landlords in the US lifted all restrictions on companion animals. So those would be like restrictions based on breed or size. About 6.5 million companion animals enter shelters annually, and housing issues are one of the main reasons for surrender. And in my research, also, I find one of the main reasons for abandoning animals who then get picked up and are classified as strays. So this kind of a change in housing policy could have a really major impact. Finally, we need to be open to thinking about if, how, and where community animals could be part of our social fabric. In referring to community animals, I don't mean abandoned animals who live without reliable sources of food, water, shelter, care, or affection. In fact, I mean quite the opposite: animals who live as part of a community of human and non-human animals, who form bonds with members of this community at their will, who give and receive care, and who experience lives with greater freedom than most animals who currently live as so-called owned pets. So there are ways for us to improve the safety and care of community animals, including the many who already are living among us, particularly cats, and to imagine them as part of our social worlds. Together, these steps would improve the life chances of companion animals and the quality of life and the life chances of people. The companion animal welfare industry, I just want to say in conclusion, is plastic. Even if it's been following a particular pathway, that path isn't fixed. We can change it. And that change doesn't have to occur only in existing frameworks. We have the ability and the creativity and the capacity to create new ones. If your initial reaction to some of this is it's impossible, keep in mind that abolition has already happened at least once in US history through the closure of forced institutionalization of disabled people in state mental hospitals and homes for the so-called feeble-minded. Our failure in that instance was in not building a meaningful web of resources for these people and those who are their caregivers. So we can learn a lot from that example, both positively and negatively. And it's time for us to be having these serious conversations about our shelter system and to be imagining new possibilities that can revolutionize how our society supports bonds between human and non-human animals and allows people and animals to sustain those bonds continuously. Thank you. So I'm going to stop here. And
Thank
I'm not sure where.
Kristen, did you want to say more? Do you want to move to question and answer? So you want to move to question and answer?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Great. So there's a couple questions already there. So one comes from an anonymous attendee, and this person is interested in, it's interesting, this question came in just before Dr. Guenther started talking about the idea of animals as property. So it was a well-timed question. But the question is about how, from the sheltering and rescue perspective, you manage to deal with there's two issues here: the injustice of thinking of companion animals as property, as well as inherent justices surrounding companion animals generally, like they have a less autonomy, is the example that this person gave. Do you need any clarity or?
I guess I just want to say one thing, and I think Dr. Guenther probably has an answer to this one, but what this means on the ground in an animal shelter is if an animal comes into a shelter and was a seizure from a person being arrested for different charges, that animal was considered property and can sit in a kennel in isolation, unable to be touched or interacted with for years at a time. And that is not abnormal. It's actually pretty common. And so the property status of animals is hugely impactful, and it creates humane issues every day in almost every one of our communities in animal shelters. And this takes a whole variety of forms. Here in Texas, we can't treat owned animals because of that. There are medically in shelters, there are a lot of ways that harms animals. And there are considerations that have to be taken if we were to consider giving animals a different status, and what that would mean for those animals, but also for our communities in general. And so it's not an uncomplicated, in our limited view, it's not an uncomplicated, animals just need to be granted the same status as humans or something else, because everything has a lot of implications, because regardless of status, they're still caught up in a lot of these systems of power. So that is my non-answer to that question. And hopefully Katja has something more helpful to say.
No, I think that was a good answer, at least for me, because I think this question is in part asking about the perspective within shelters, within the sheltering community, and how, you know, members of that community might respond to thinking about, if I'm reading the question correctly, to thinking about the property status of companion animals. And it would absolutely be, you know, a pretty marked change if animals were understood as having their own interests, and that if shelter workers, instead of the current model, thought of themselves as sort of temporary guardians, to, you know, more courage to think of themselves that way, to individuals who have their own interests, right, that animals have their own interests, and that these shelter staff would be, you know, listening to that, that would be a pretty significant shift from how shelter workers typically relate to animals in the current system. I'd also add that I think one of the as an interdisciplinary scholar, but also as someone whose work in a lot of ways, you know, just cuts across other kinds of boundaries, like being active in the nonprofit sector and in academia, for example. You know, I think one area we can really learn so much from is really the scholarship on the efforts at establishing legal personhood for animals in the context of other types of confined animals. A lot of those cases have centered especially on primates being kept in laboratories or by private owners as pets or as companion animals, and also the animals who are kept in zoos and in animaltainment programs, right? And I think the film Blackfish, for example, you know, in and of itself contributed to a marked shift in public awareness about what it means when animals are property, and how that places animals and people at risk, and creates a wide range of ethical problems. And there's a rich and deep literature in the broader scholarship on law and animals that specifically focuses on animal personhood. And I think that the companion animal welfare community needs to start engaging with that conversation. They've really been two separated and isolated worlds of activity. Companion animal welfare doesn't often intersect with the animal rights or animal liberation movement more broadly. And I think if that changed, there would be a lot of important cross-fertilization. Oh, Carol, I think you're muted now. Sorry. No, that's okay. I'm leaving myself muted permanently. But
I don't know if you're aware of the CNVR model, the Bhutan CNVR model. We have a question from Liz here. So if you are aware of that model, do you think you could explain it to us and then tell us if you think that could work here and provide a more humane system in the United States?
I'm guessing it's a community management strategy. If you want to clarify, I just commented in the chat, I'm not familiar with the Bhutan model, but I'm guessing it's probably a community management of animals.
I can allow Liz to clarify if you're comfortable with that, Liz. I'll give you speaking rights.
Great.
Yeah.
I actually, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, I actually don't know too much about it other than reading an article and watching a movie, I think it was called Dogs, about that. Bhutan is a really interesting country. It's one of the very few in the world that measures happiness rather than just the GDP. They actually measure the happiness of the culture. And they've taken a really different approach to managing dogs. So capturing, neutering, and then they release them back into the community. And I think there's definitely some issues surrounding it. Like not all the dogs are, receive medical care and things like that. But the people in the community kind of see them as fellow citizens, feeding them, kind of caring for them, but they live on the streets. So that's about all I know about it. It's very interesting, but I was just wondering if I don't know, something along those lines might be possible here. Thank you.
Are you trying to unmute, Katja?
No, I think I'm okay. Thank you. Do you want to respond to that first?
Yes. So just quickly, I just found the article. It's really exciting, and I'll read it. And if the barking dogs drive you nuts, I will stop talking for a minute. It's part of the deal here. So yes, I think that we have taken community dog sterilization and care off the table in the US, and it's been a huge mistake. This has been going on for many, many years, and the intensification of the insistence on keeping dogs in particular in strict isolation in their own yards has actually created more of the problem. And we need to put it back on the table as a strategy. Maybe not everywhere. We get it. There are cars and they're dangerous, but in many communities, it is a viable option. It's being practiced, but quietly, because in most places, leash laws make it fundamentally illegal to treat or care for any animal, any dog on the street.
Yeah, and I think we also need to see a greater commitment. I'm currently doing research on the people, overwhelmingly women, who care for community cats, or so-called feral cats, here in the Los Angeles area. And there's been a whole philanthropic mini industry that has sprung up around trap, neuter, release, but almost none of it intersects at all with our animal shelters. Animal control agencies completely wipe their hands of any responsibility for caring for community cats. There are a few shelters in this region that will offer limited numbers of spaces to people who trap community cats and bring them in for spay and neuter services, but most of those spay and neuter services are taking place through privately funded organizations like Fix Nation and Spay for LA and so forth. It is really a case of sort of total abandonment by state agencies of addressing this problem. And I don't think that Los Angeles is unique in that regard either. And where if we had a much more systematic approach, it would be significantly beneficial to the quality of life that the community cats are living, to have them routinely trapped, not just spayed and neutered, but then periodically thereafter, so that they can get health checkups, routine vaccinations, access to care when they have injuries and so forth. And virtually none of that exists now unless individual Good Samaritans are caring for a specific colony and have the personal resources to pay for those kinds of services.
So that answer brings up, speaks to, there's a couple of questions about like the real technicalities of how this works, and I think one of them specifically looks at money, and one looks at how you would start this up. So I'll give you both questions at once, and maybe you can decide if the answers go together or separately. But one question is, how do you propose to fix the problem of people not being able to afford the medical needs of their animals? But I might add to that also community animals, for example. And then another person asked if you envision it would be best by starting these resource centers separately from current shelters, or by having a resource liaison at the shelter to facilitate keeping animals and people together. So different questions, but both really focused on like, what does this look like when it comes together, and some of these issues that are causing current problems now, how do we deal with them?
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think in response to the second question about sort of the institutional design, I think part of what Haas Human Animal Support Services, the project that Kristen is directing, is doing, is having and creating sort of resource liaisons and programs within current shelters, emphasizing keeping people and animals together. So we're already seeing that happen, and there are other organizations that have different kinds of shelter, so-called shelter intervention programs, where a worker from the sometimes the ASPCA or from another private local group might be sitting outside a shelter during peak shelter hours and will offer services to people who are coming in to surrender their animals. But I think the longer term vision is that these would be functionally separate institutions. I at least, I don't want to speak for Kristen, I don't see a way in which our current shelters are going to be effectively reformed into human animal resource centers. Among other things, just the physical space of them in many cases doesn't provide for what these new facilities would need to be providing. They're full of kennels and not full of meeting spaces and office spaces and places where people can talk with each other. The shelter where I conducted my field work, the staff literally are sitting on top of each other to do their work. There is no space in which members of the community can privately talk with a staff member. So we need to, think about, building or severely modifying existing buildings and spaces so that they can accommodate these new kinds of programmatic emphasis.
And I would take that a step further and say that we can't keep thinking about even centers or sort of geographically isolated spaces where we help animals. We have to think more broadly about what it would mean to totally transform the way we even think about animal issues, so that animal welfare is built into our hospitals, it's built into our domestic violence shelters, it's built into our community centers. And we, in the future, we do need those resource centers. But I mean, I don't envision those as one place that everyone goes. I envision those as places in neighborhoods where people go to get help, or safe places for lost dogs where they can have a pit stop and get home quickly. As far as shelters, in 10 years, I hope, maybe even in 5 years, that they're not shelters anymore. They're emergency rooms, because we know animals need emergency critical care, whether they're lost, just wandering around, or they have an owner. They need that critical emergency care. And we know that people desperately need help finding housing for their pets. And that's not a simple hand them a flyer and go figure it out. We need to integrate so much more fully so that animals have a seat at the table in every community conversation, and no human services agency is planning their future without bringing animals along with them, so that they really are considering animals to be family members. And then the shelter, it isn't that the shelter function doesn't exist. We know animals can't speak, and they might need a pit stop, a place to stop on their way back home or on their way somewhere else. But shelters housing animals in strict solitary confinement for months to years at a time, shelters bringing in such massive numbers of animals that those animals, totally innocent, get horrible diseases that kill them. That is a human rights issue. It's not just an animal rights issue, and shelter staff aren't putting up with it anymore. We see shelter staff quitting in higher numbers than any time in my career. They're saying no, they're not going to continue to do this work. So if we don't figure it out, we don't have people willing to perform these functions anymore. It isn't an option. It isn't a new program. We have to change this system, because society is telling us they're not going to put up with it anymore. And so the future needs to be a total rethinking of what the resource centers looks like. And I want to respond to Joe's question about people that can't afford to keep their pets. I don't think either of us are unrealistic that we're working in a system that is profoundly unfair and unequal and has all forms of inequality built into all of these institutions. And again, I think to echo Katja, it doesn't mean we don't try, and it doesn't mean we don't lay out a new vision, knowing that there will be people that are not just economically can't provide veterinary care, but can't provide food for their animals on a regular basis. But that is happening more often than you think right now. Right now, millions of Americans are struggling to feed themselves and their pets. And so we need to do things like help them figure out what human foods their pets can eat. Like, we have to be more realistic about what people are dealing with. People are struggling to survive, and so are their animals, because their animals live with them. And just taking their animals away, that doesn't help them survive any better. It actually is really inhumane to those people. And so the title of this presentation is intentional, that we have to do everything we can to alleviate suffering, I think, of people and animals in this time.
Thank you. There's a question here that's specifically for you, Katja, and I think it might speak to a lot of the academics who are here today from that perspective. The question comes from Colin, who asks, have you received any resistance in academia for including companion animals in the discussion of the effects of race, gender, and class? Unfortunately, the conversation seems to be very rare. Thank you for doing this work.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. It's a question, encountering resistance. There's so many different ways of thinking about resistance. So I will say in sociological circles, and especially in feminist studies circles, my work has been generally very, very positively received. But I still absolutely encounter the routine roadblock that I think all animal studies scholars working, especially in the social sciences, encounter, which is that animal studies isn't really about humans, or how the question of like, what does this really have to do with people? Usually from people who haven't yet read any of my work. So this isn't folks, who are coming with these questions who've read the book or read other publications of mine. But certainly I don't think that animal studies broadly has yet found the level of respect and recognition that it needs to have within the social sciences more broadly, and within sociology specifically. That being said, I think it's perhaps interesting for folks here to know that the primary criticism that I've actually encountered has been from within the companion animal welfare movement, and especially individuals who promote racist ideologies and who use this new politically charged language around critical race theory that's become such a flashpoint in American politics over the last year or so, to attack my work and distort quite egregiously some of the findings of that work. So the most significant, resistance or hostility has not come from within academic circles. It's come from within animal rights circles, and specifically among people who purport to be advocates for companion animals, but who unfortunately don't seem to have very high levels, if any levels, of compassion for people. So that's been kind of an eye-opening experience. I had anticipated that there would be, discomfort, because I am in my work engaged in critique of, which is not the same as being critical of, but engaged in critique of the shelter where I did my field work, and also aspects of the rescue community. And in those domains, people have been so open, it's been overwhelming. So to then, have attacks coming from folks who think of themselves as sort of leaders in animal welfare has been really, really troubling and disheartening.
Kristen, did you want to add anything to that? Well, we are almost out of time, so I just want to thank everyone who came and attended and made this a really wonderful webinar. We are recording this webinar, and anyone who's registered will be notified when the recording's ready. To be fully transparent, I've never recorded a webinar before, so I am not completely sure how long it takes me to access the recording or how easy it is to send to all of you, but all of you who are registered, I have your email addresses, so I will notify you when that is ready. I would really like to thank Kristen and Katja for coming here and taking this time to share their ideas with us, and to all the panelists for keeping everything, all the attendees for keeping everything engaging and asking such great questions. I think we just got a question, but we're out of time, so I can't get to it. And if anyone asks something very, very specific to their situation, I copied down your comment and I will send you an email later and put you in touch with the speakers then. We're going to have another colloquium coming up, probably the last week of November. Maddie is going to be speaking. So make sure that if you are not already, you get on the ASI listserv so that you can get notified of that. And if you are in the Animals and Society section of the ASA, you will be getting an email about the date and time of that. So I'd like to thank you all so much, and I hope you have a good rest of your week and a good weekend.